It's always been possible to break interception missions when you're going for longer periods, and it seems that doing so is easier in arbitrations than anywhere else. And the few longer runs that I've done as a VAR in the past, it was possible to distract enemies reliably enough with a noise arrow to pull them into a single location, and then you just keep them there with repeated sleep arrows. It's a little different with arbitrations. It doesn't matter what kind of enemies spawn, and you don't need to constantly interact with them, as they will just break eventually for whatever reason. So the goal is basically just to stay invisible at all times and to send noise arrows towards the center of the map to distract as many enemies as possible while you do a lap of the perimeter and capture all the towers. If you're paying attention to the enemy patterns, it quickly becomes apparent that only a few enemies are attempting to capture towers at any one time. You usually target the first one you capture and take it back in the time it takes you to capture the other three, resulting in you needing to recapture it and immobilize those enemies. I was doing so by firing a single noise arrow at them, which distracts them, and then they forget about capturing towers until they are despawned and new enemies with fresh AI take their place. This happened reliably for the first 30 waves or so. During that time, the amount of enemies I needed to kill at the end of each round quickly diminished. I started at 7, it started at 7, and it worked its way down to 1. The reason for this is that the enemies that weren't actively capturing towers had no direction. They couldn't see towers, couldn't see any hostiles, so they had nothing to do and eventually just stopped moving entirely. Considered these enemies to be bugged and went out of my way to avoid killing them, slowly bugging out more and more enemies until the entire spawn pool was filled with them, which meant I no longer needed to kill anything at the end of a round and nothing attempted to capture towers. It took about 30 waves before I no longer needed to kill anything, and 50-ish before I no longer needed to use noise arrows. The enemies I've shown here have persisted since those very early rounds, as you can tell by their level. I'll show all the builds at the end, even though they're mostly irrelevant. I took Covert Lethality because I was expecting to deal with enemy scaling, and I spent most of the time holding the synthesis scanner to prevent accidentally firing a loud weapon to break invisibility. There were a few cases where drones or enemies needed to be killed, and for those I either put them to sleep and stabbed them, or stepped into a cloak arrow bubble and sniped them with the Vectus. This is also how I regenerated energy, just moving into a position far away from the enemy view and using Xeneric inside the bubble. In hindsight, invisibility was probably unnecessary, but at the time it wasn't worth the risk of unbreaking the enemy AI. This recording is probably 6 months old. At that time I tested the strategy against the Grenier, the Corpus and the Orokin with identical results. I ran another test a few weeks ago just to make sure this information is still relevant, and that was against the Corpus, and it still worked fine. It's also interesting to note that the leaderboards show a time lower than my in-game time, as it doesn't care about the time spent paused. People were talking about long runs in Discord, and it came up that DE can potentially suspend your trading privileges temporarily if they detect abnormal results from a mission. This didn't happen to me, but I did see some screenshots of it happening to others and found that quite interesting, so just something to be aware of. In any case, that's really all I have to say. My builds are at the end, my leaderboards are shown at the end, and I'm just going to let the footage play out.